1. Opening. The shock question. Imagine this. It's the dead of winter on the Great Plains. Temperatures plunge to 40 degrees below zero. The wind howls like a living creature, tearing across a white, frozen world. And somewhere out there, in the middle of that merciless cold, entire families are sleeping, peacefully, inside nothing more than a cloth and hide shelter lit by a small fire. No insulated walls, no electricity, no modern heating systems. Just a conical home pressed against the fury of winter, and yet they survived. Not barely, not by chance, but year after year, generation after generation. So the real question is this: how did they do it? How did people with no synthetic insulation, no thermal blankets, and no weather forecasts withstand temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in minutes? Was it the fire? Was it the shelter? Or was it something modern Americans have quietly forgotten? Something deeper than any single tool or technique? For centuries, Plains tribes were not simply enduring winter. They were mastering it. Their secret was never a single trick, never a lucky discovery, never a mystical bond with nature. Their secret was systems thinking, a complete and integrated understanding of cold, air, wind, terrain, and the human body. And as you're about to see, their survival wasn't primitive at all. It was engineering refined through brutal experience, sharpened by necessity, and more advanced than many designs we depend on today. Stay with me, because once you understand what they knew, winter will never look the same again. Second, Trick 1. Location is life. Cold kills faster than hunger. Before a single pole was raised or a fire ever lit, winter survival began with one decision: location. To the Plains tribes, choosing a campsite in winter was not a matter of convenience. It was mathematics. It was physics. It was life or death. The first principle was simple but profound. Cold air behaves like water. It flows downhill. It pools in valleys. It fills low ground the same way water fills a basin. And any family sleeping inside that cold pool could wake up frozen before the sun returned. That's why experienced winter travelers avoided valley floors, riverbeds, and shallow depressions. These were natural freezers, invisible to the inexperienced, but unmistakable to those who had felt death creeping in with the night air. Instead, tribes positioned their camps on slight rises, just 10 or 15 feet higher than the surrounding terrain. That small elevation difference could mean a 10-degree temperature shift, enough to turn a deadly night into a survivable one. It was microclimate engineering, practiced centuries before the term existed. They sought out natural windbreaks, stands of dense forest, rock formations that stored heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, and hills that deflected the brutal northern winds that tore across the plains. What seems obvious to us now was rediscovered only recently by military science. During World War II, thousands of soldiers froze, not because of poor equipment, but because they camped in the wrong terrain, inside frost pockets identical to the ones the Plains tribes avoided. US Army cold weather doctrine eventually caught up, emphasizing slope, wind direction, and cold air drainage. But by then, history had already shown who understood winter first. And here is the uncomfortable lesson for modern America. Our suburban neighborhoods are often built in the very places Plains tribes refuse to touch. Low-lying subdivisions become frost traps during cold snaps. Mobile homes and RVs, lightweight, poorly insulated, and often placed in exposed lots, are disasters waiting to happen when winter storms hit. The land still follows the same physics it did centuries ago. But we, unlike the people who survived here long before us, rarely pay attention. Location was not a preference, it was protection, it was strategy. It was the first genius trick of winter survival, and it remains as relevant today as it was then. Third trick 2. The teepee was not a tent. It was a wind deflection machine. When most people picture a teepee, They imagine a simple cone of animal hide, a primitive shelter barely capable of blocking the cold. But that image could not be further from the truth. The teepee was not a tent. It was an aerodynamic structure engineered through centuries of trial, failure, and refinement, something closer to a natural wind deflection machine than any modern camping shelter on the market today. To understand its genius, imagine a winter storm sweeping across the Great Plains. The wind doesn't just blow, it slams, it punches, it tears at anything with flat walls. Modern cabins, especially those with rigid square structures, take the full force of that pressure. That is why, even today, houses in the Midwest collapse under the weight of wind-driven snow or buckle when gusts reach 70 or 80 miles per hour. Flat surfaces fight the wind, and the wind always wins. But a teepee does something extraordinary. Instead of resisting the wind, it redirects it. The conical shape splits the airflow, sending it upward and spiraling around the sides. There are no sharp edges, no flat planes, nothing for the wind to seize and rip apart. The entire structure behaves like the nose of a well-designed aircraft, smooth, curved, and aerodynamic. Tests on traditional teepee designs show they can withstand gusts stronger than many modern tents, not because they are built from stronger materials, but because they cooperate with the forces trying to destroy them. Even more remarkable is the flexibility of the structure. While modern cabins crack under pressure, the teepee bends, shifts, and returns to form. A rigid wall has a breaking point, a flexible frame does not. This principle, flexibility over rigidity, is the same concept used in earthquake-resistant buildings today. Yet the Plains tribes mastered it long before architects ever wrote about load distribution or oscillation damping. The lesson for modern America is uncomfortable but necessary. Many winter home failures are not because the cold is too strong, but because the design is too stubborn. When walls fight the wind, humans lose. When structures absorb and redirect the wind, humans survive. The teepee endures because it listens to nature instead of resisting it, standing as a quiet reminder that ancient engineering was not primitive at all. It was elegant, efficient, and in many ways decades ahead of what we call modern design. Fourth, Trick 3. Breathable skins beat modern plastics. Moisture kills before cold does. One of the deadliest misunderstandings in winter survival is believing that cold alone kills. In reality, moisture is often the real assassin. And this is where the Plains tribes mastered something many modern campers still get wrong. A shelter must breathe. If it cannot release the moisture generated by human bodies, it becomes a trap. A wet, freezing cave where hypothermia takes hold long before the temperature drops to its lowest point. Buffalo hide became the perfect material, not because it was thick, but because it breathed. It blocked wind while still allowing humidity to escape through microscopic pores in the skin. That balance prevented condensation from forming inside the shelter. Anyone who has spent a winter night in a modern synthetic tent knows the opposite feeling. Waking to droplets clinging to the walls, gear soaked, sleeping bags damp, and body heat evaporating twice as fast. Modern plastics seal in moisture, and moisture, when trapped, accelerates heat loss faster than most people realize. The science behind this is simple. As warm air from breathing and body heat rises, it carries water vapor with it. If that vapor hits a cold, impermeable surface, it condenses. Condensation absorbs heat energy, pulling warmth directly from the bodies inside the shelter. This is why so many hypothermia cases occur even when people have enough insulation. They don't lose heat through the air, they lose it through moisture. In fact, modern search and rescue reports repeatedly show hypothermia victims found in high-end tents or insulated cabins with the same problem. Damp clothing, wet sleeping bags, and condensation dripping from the roof. Their gear did not fail. Physics did what physics always does. The Plains tribes solved this with breathable materials, adjustable smoke flaps, and an internal air gap that kept moisture moving upward and outward. The shelter stayed dry. and a dry shelter stays warm. This leads to a powerful lesson for modern America. More insulation does not always mean more warmth. Sometimes it means more moisture trapped against your skin, more condensation on your walls, and more danger creeping in silently through the night. The biggest flaw in many camping products today is that they prioritize sealing the cold out rather than moving moisture through. And in winter, dryness is survival. The teepee did not try to trap heat, it tried to maintain balance. And in doing so, it created a warm, dry microclimate, far more comfortable and far safer than most people would ever believe possible. Fifth trick. 4. Fire was the most dangerous tool. Fire saves you or kills you. Fire is humanity's oldest ally, but in winter survival, it is also humanity's oldest killer. The Plains tribes understood this better than almost any culture on Earth. They knew that possessing fire did not guarantee warmth. Only managing it did. And mismanaging it just once could turn a shelter into a smoke-filled death trap, or leave a family shivering beside a pile of ashes long before sunrise. Inside a teepee, fire was not a roaring blaze. It was a precisely controlled machine. Its power came from balance, not intensity. The depth of the fire pit mattered more than most people realize. Dig it too deep, and the heat disappears into the ground instead of radiating outward. Make it too shallow, and sparks leap into the hides above, threatening to ignite the very structure meant to protect you. Generations of experience taught the Plains tribes where that perfect depth lay. 6 to 8 inches, just enough to harness heat without losing control. But the wood itself was equally important. Cedar burned bright and fast, a burst of warmth that lit the shelter quickly, yet it offered little longevity. Oak, on the other hand, released its heat slowly, steadily, almost rhythmically, like a heartbeat sustaining the night. And then there was the burn geometry, the way logs were arranged, not to look beautiful, but to create the right draft, the right airflow, the right oxygen exchange. A poorly stacked fire collapses inward, suffocating itself. A well-designed one breathes, lifting smoke upward and heat outward in a perfect spiral. If this sounds like naval engineering, that's because it is. On ships during the Age of Sail, fire discipline was strict because a single mistake could sink an entire vessel. And inside submarines, managing oxygen, smoke, and fuel became the difference between surfacing alive or never surfacing at all. The logic was identical. Fire without a system becomes a coffin. Today, modern Americans forget this at their peril. Every winter, portable heaters, generators, and improvised heat sources kill families through carbon monoxide poisoning or house fires. People assume the presence of heat equals safety. It never has. Heat without management is simply danger disguised as comfort. For the Plains tribes, fire was not a convenience, it was a responsibility. Someone stayed awake through the night to monitor it, to add wood, to adjust the airflow, to ensure neither smoke nor silence filled the shelter. Warmth was earned through discipline, and that discipline is a lesson just as relevant in our modern age of winter blackouts, failing grids, and silent CO leaks. Fire saves you, or it kills you, and only knowledge decides which outcome you get. Sixth, trick 5. The ground is your enemy. Most heat is lost below you. Most people fear the cold air above them, but seasoned winter survivors know the real enemy lies beneath their bodies. Frozen earth is a thief, an unforgiving, relentless heat vampire that pulls warmth downward faster than any wind can steal it sideways. The Plains tribes treated the ground as their most dangerous adversary, and they engineered their defenses with remarkable precision. Their bedding system was not simply a pile of hides. It was a multi-layered thermal strategy, a design so effective that modern militaries eventually adopted the same principles. First came woven mats of willow branches, elevated just enough to break direct contact with the frozen soil. The weaving trapped tiny air pockets that served as natural insulation, slowing conduction. Above that lay thick bundles of dried grasses, chosen for their ability to stay warm even in damp conditions. Only then came the buffalo robes, fur side up, creating a soft but highly insulating surface. This three-layer system mirrored the very same approach used in World War II sleeping mats and later refined during the Cold War. Soldiers learned, many through deadly mistakes, that even the warmest sleeping bag becomes useless when pressed against frozen ground. The insulation compresses, the loft collapses, and body heat channels straight into the earth. Modern campers repeat the mistake every winter. They sleep on thick bags but thin pads, and they wake up cold, confused, and dangerously close to hypothermia. The mistake isn't lack of warmth. The mistake is contacting the ground, and the consequences extend beyond camping. Across America, homeless deaths spike every time a cold wave hits, not because people lack blankets, but because they lack insulation beneath them. Once the ground pulls enough heat from the body, no number of layers above can compensate. Understanding the difference between conduction and convection is not just academic. Conduction kills quietly. It doesn't howl like the wind. It doesn't sting like freezing air. It simply drains you until there is nothing left. That is why the order of insulation matters far more than its thickness. A thin, well-placed layer beneath the body can save more heat than the thickest blanket piled on top. The Plains tribes knew this intuitively, not through equations, but through centuries of trial and error. They understood that warmth does not come from how much you cover yourself, but from how well you separate your body from the frozen earth below. And that insight remains one of the most practical, life-saving winter truths ever discovered. 7th. Trick 6. Human heat was engineered. Social survival, not individual comfort. There is a modern myth that survival is an individual pursuit, that strength comes from isolation and endurance comes from personal toughness. But in the brutal winters of the Great Plains, nothing could be further from the truth. The Plains tribes understood that the human body is a furnace, and like any furnace, it performs best when supported by other sources of heat. Their genius lay not only in how they built shelters, but in how they arranged themselves within them. Sleeping positions were not random, they were engineered. Adults with the highest metabolic heat were placed along the outer edges of the sleeping area, forming a living wall of warmth to shield children and elders at the center. Those most vulnerable to hypothermia were positioned where the air was warmest, close to the fire pit, but not directly exposed to its smoke. Families slept in shallow, nest-like depressions in the bedding layers, shaping pockets of warm air that would persist throughout the night. Every inch mattered, and every placement was part of a larger thermal strategy. This concept of shared heat appears across history in unexpected places. Trench soldiers in the First World War slept in coordinated rotations, pressing close together to survive nights that dropped below freezing. Arctic explorers learned to position themselves in tightly controlled formations to keep the weakest members alive. Even mountaineering teams use body grouping during storms, forming heat rings to preserve the core temperature of every climber. The science is always the same. Humans produce heat, and that heat multiplies when shared. Yet modern America often works against this principle. Extreme individualism teaches people to isolate themselves under separate blankets, in separate tents, or even in separate rooms. During disasters, emergency shelters pack individuals onto cots spaced far apart, unintentionally making everyone colder. And in many winter emergencies, people freeze, not because the air is too cold, but because they try to survive it alone. The Plains tribes remind us of a truth as old as humanity itself. Warmth is a collective achievement. Survival is a social act. And in a harsh winter, individual comfort means little if the group cannot endure. By designing their sleeping arrangements around shared heat, they transformed human connection into a physical survival mechanism. one we would be wise to remember in a world that increasingly prioritizes isolation over cooperation. 8. Trick 7. Fat, ash, and skin science. Ancient vapor barriers. In the icy winds of the plains winter, clothing alone was never enough. Wind slices through fabric, steals warmth from exposed skin, and freezes moisture instantly. But the plains tribes possessed an ancient form of skin technology, one far older and more effective than many modern products. They understood that the human body needed not just insulation, but protection from evaporation, windburn, and radiant heat loss. And they built that protection using simple, powerful materials: animal fat and ash. Buffalo tallow, when applied to the skin, formed a dense, waxy layer that blocked wind and sealed in moisture. It worked as a natural vapor barrier, preventing precious body heat from escaping into the cold. Bear fat offered even stronger protection, ideal for the most extreme temperatures. Deer fat was softer and more breathable, often used for children whose skin needed gentler treatment. These fats created a microclimate directly on the body, turning exposed skin into a warm, wind-resistant surface. Ash played an equally important role. Mixed with fat, it produced a dark, carbon-rich paste that absorbed radiant heat from the fire and held it longer. The tiny carbon particles functioned like modern thermal coatings, capturing warmth the way black surfaces capture sunlight. This mixture also protected the skin from frostbite by reducing wind contact and slowing heat transfer. Long before chemistry textbooks existed, the plains tribes were practicing thermal science on a molecular level. Modern mountaineers now use vapor barrier liners, thin synthetic layers worn inside sleeping bags to prevent moisture loss. These serve the same purpose the tribes achieved with fat and ash. Yet despite all our advancements, frostbite remains common in the United States, especially during unexpected cold snaps. People trust their gloves, their jackets, their expensive winter gear, but forget that skin itself needs protection. And modern skincare products, designed for comfort rather than survival, fail miserably when temperatures plunge below zero. The lesson is simple but profound. In winter, warmth does not begin with fabric, it begins with the skin. And the plains tribes perfected this insight through centuries of harsh experience. Their methods may look ancient, but their logic is timeless. When the wind rises and the cold deepens, it is not the sophistication of your gear that determines survival. It is the sophistication of your understanding. 9th. Trick 8. Dogs, terrain, and night security. Cold makes predators bold. When temperatures drop, hunger rises. And in the heart of a plains winter, the cold didn't just threaten the people, it awakened predators desperate enough to approach firelight. Wolves, mountain lions, even bears pushed closer to human camps when food ran scarce. But the plains tribes did not rely on chance or luck to protect themselves. They relied on one of the most sophisticated early warning systems in human history: their dogs. These were not pets, they were sentinels. Raised from puppyhood to read the night, to distinguish between the rustle of prey and the approach of a predator, to bark in different tones depending on the danger. Their voices carried information the same way modern security systems send coded alerts. A low rumble for wolves, a sharp, urgent bark for large, solitary predators, a frantic pattern for threats that demanded immediate action. Before the adults inside the teepee even opened their eyes, the dogs had already drawn the map of the night. But terrain was part of the defense too. Camps were rarely placed in open fields where threats could come from any direction. Instead, snow mounds, brush patterns, and the natural lay of the land funneled predators into predictable paths. Anyone or anything approaching the camp would be heard long before it was seen. Contrast this with modern security. Today we sleep behind locked doors and thin walls, convinced we are safe because we have alarms, cameras, and porch lights. Yet one power outage is enough to collapse that illusion. In a blackout, our systems fail instantly. The plains tribes built security that needed no electricity, no batteries, and no network. It functioned through training, intuition, and the bond between humans and animals. And the uncomfortable truth is this: cold still makes predators bold. Whether it is wildlife on the edge of hunger or human desperation during winter disasters, danger increases when temperatures drop. The tribes prepared for this every night. Most of us don't prepare at all. Their system of security teaches a timeless principle. Survival is never just about staying warm, it is about staying aware. 10th. The real secret. Systems thinking. Why modern America forgot this. As we look across all 8 survival techniques, a pattern emerges, one that challenges nearly everything we believe about ancient life. Plains tribes did not survive winter because they had better tools. They survived because they understood how every piece of their world connected to every other piece. Shelter was only effective because fire was managed correctly. Fire only worked because ventilation and moisture control were built into the teepee. Bedding only mattered because ground insulation, airflow, and shared body heat were all coordinated. And none of it could function without nightly routines, social roles, and mutual responsibility. This is the heart of systems thinking. Nothing works in isolation. Survival is not a single skill. It is a network of skills that reinforce each other, each one fragile on its own, but powerful when combined. Modern America, however, has moved in the opposite direction. We buy gear believing it will save us. We look for one product, one trick, one solution. A thicker jacket, a stronger heater, a more expensive tent. Yet gear cannot replace knowledge. We pile tools into our garages without understanding the principles they are supposed to support. And there lies the irony. With all our technology, we have forgotten what the plains tribes practiced instinctively. The cold doesn't kill because it is strong. It kills because we are unprepared, because we ignore the interconnected systems that make survival possible. So if there is one lesson we should carry forward, it is this: winter is not an enemy you defeat with a single weapon. It is a puzzle you solve by understanding how fire, shelter, routine, structure, awareness, and community work together. That was the genius of the plains tribes, and it is a genius we desperately need to rediscover. 11th. Closing. The lesson for today. The plains tribes were never behind. They were ahead, far ahead in the one skill modern civilization has begun to lose: the ability to see nature as a system, to recognize patterns, to engineer solutions that require no electricity and no fragile technology. Their survival was not an act of desperation, it was the result of mastery. And today, as winters grow harsher, as storms cut power to millions, as modern homes fail under conditions that teepees once endured, their wisdom becomes more relevant than ever. Because the moment the grid fails, history returns. Cold becomes real again. The rules of survival shift back to the way they have always been: simple, unforgiving, and profoundly human. Here at Historia Prime, we don't explore the past to admire it, we explore it to survive the future. Thank you for watching, and if you want to journey deeper into forgotten knowledge and rediscovered resilience, make sure you subscribe. The next story is already waiting.